The American chiefs of staff wanted to go straight into Northwest Europe, and Churchill, I think very sensibly, Hugo, said no, and his chiefs of staff, that would be a disaster. We don't have enough landing craft. We don't have enough troops. We're going to get wiped out. The Germans have 40 divisions in France. So let's go to North Africa when we can cause some real trouble.
In the early months of 1943, the Axis powers suffered three huge defeats that changed the course of the Second World War. The American victory against the Japanese at Guadalcanal and the Soviet defeat of Nazi Germany at Stalingrad are well remembered as having been key turning points in the conflict. But the Allied victory in North Africa has, at least according to my next guest, been overlooked. The collapse of Axis troops in Tunisia was viewed as a catastrophe on a par with Stalingrad by the German public, who wryly dubbed it Tunisgrad, but it still seemed by some as a sideshow. Well, Tunisgrad, Victory in Africa, is the new book by the historian Saul David, who joins me now. Saul, welcome to Times Radio.
Thanks, Hugo. Good to be here.
Thanks very much for being with us. Can you explain for us the background then? When did the fighting in North Africa begin, and why was that area so very important?
Well, it begins in the autumn of 1940 when the Italians, who rather cynically had entered the war against Britain and France, pretty much when France had already been defeated. So that's in June of 1940. And a few months later, in an attempt to recreate a Roman Empire and to get his hands on the Suez Canal and to create a land bridge between his then colony in Libya, which had been held by the Italians since 1912, and also to link with Abyssinia, which had been grabbed more recently in the 1930s. He ordered his armies to invade Egypt, which at that time was not a British colony. It was a sort of former mandate, but it was actually being defended by British and Commonwealth troops, a relatively small force. So until the events that we're discussing, which is the autumn of 1942. So you've got this period from the autumn of 1940 to 1942, this toing and froing in the desert. Initially a successful incursion by the Italians, then they're pushed back, then the Germans come in with Rommel and his Africa Corps. And by the time of Operation Torch, which was the invasion of French North Africa by British and American troops, the first time they'd fought together in the Second World War. The question is, what do we do next? And the American chiefs of staff wanted to go straight into Northwest Europe. And Churchill, I think very sensibly, Hugo, said no, and his chiefs of staff, that would be a disaster. We don't have enough landing craft. We don't have enough troops. We're going to get wiped out. The Germans have 40 divisions in France. So let's go to North Africa when we can cause some real trouble. There was real strategic benefits from capturing North Africa because it's going to control the Mediterranean, and it's also going to open up southern France for future landings.
Well, why were the Americans initially reluctant to focus on North Africa? Did they just not much care about North Africa?
Well, they didn't really get the strategic underpinning of the plan. Interestingly enough, and the reason they do go to North Africa in the autumn of 1942 is that the President Roosevelt did understand. And it's quite telling, I think, Hugo, that he's a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He sort of gets the idea that sea power is going to be tremendously important in this war. I mean, Churchill's really, his policy at this time, he called it scatterization or kind of peripheral. And what he really wanted to do is hit Germany with a number of blows, a blockade, but also bombardment from the air, the capture of North Africa and the opening up of the Mediterranean to Allied sea power. This would save about 1 million tons of shipping that could be used elsewhere. You always have to see these campaigns in the round. It's not just in the Mediterranean, it's also in the Pacific where they needed sea power. And slowly but surely, this would bring Germany to a point where we could invade in Northwest Europe. The chiefs of staff, on the other hand, particularly led by Marshall, who was the army chief of staff, wanted to get in as quickly as possible because he feared that the Soviet Union might be knocked out of the war. And it was a risk, although interestingly, Churchill goes over to give Stalin the bad news and say, we're not coming into Northwest Europe, but we are going into North Africa. But actually, there are going to be real benefits. And according to Churchill, Stalin actually understood what they were and that there would be a real payoff to this campaign in North Africa if the Western allies doubled up and made sure that not only was the existing army there, that's Rommel's, defeated, but any extra troops the Germans could send over.
Let's talk about Rommel a bit, because I mean, how important was Rommel to German strength in North Africa beforehand, and why was he such an impressive and sort of pivotal figure?
Yeah, he's a tremendous character. I think in some ways I feel a bit ambivalent about Rommel. I have to say, Hugo, he was, people often forget, a commander of Hitler's escort battalion. He's also commanding his field headquarters during the Polish campaign. He's a great admirer of the Führer. He was never a member of the Nazi party. I think he was cunning enough not actually to go that far, but he was definitely a fellow traveler of Hitler at this point, the resurrection of Germany's military might. And he sent over in early 1941 with just two divisions, so a relatively small force to begin with. That's about, I don't know, 20,000 men. And the idea is we're going to shore up the Italians because the Italians were teetering on the edge of defeat. But what Rommel had in spades was an extraordinary ability to see a weakness in an enemy position and to go straight for it and not be frightened of the consequences. I mean, his great opponent in the desert, particularly in the period we're talking about, was Monty. And Monty was a much more careful commander. He'd build up his forces until he had just enough to actually fight a battle that was carefully planned, whereas Rommel was much more of a risk taker. And in the desert, these big wide open spaces where motorized warfare, tank warfare is very suited, or at least it is until you get into the kind of, the great sands, the great sea desert, which is about 100 miles inland. But in that coastal plain, Rommel was absolutely without peer, and he won a number of victories until slowly but surely his raw materials, he was too far, he extended his lines of communication. And this is what gave Monty a chance, particularly with extra troops, and now he was getting some of the tanks from the Americans to actually turn the tables on him at the Battle of El Alamein. And it's interesting that El Alamein comes just 4 days before the landings at Torch, which are the start of what becomes the Tunisia campaign.
How important was empire to Churchill's preoccupation with North Africa? Was there a sense, or did he have a sense that, Africa is British if it's anyone's, and these are people who are taking over our backyard?
It was definitely a factor, and it also links in with your questioning about why the Americans weren't so keen on North Africa. Some of them definitely considered Churchill's preoccupation as an attempt to shore up empire. I would argue that was part of the equation, but it wasn't the major part of the equation. By 1942, Britain is still in a very dodgy position. Actually, in the summer of 1942, when Churchill convinces the Americans to go for North Africa. They've just suffered a terrible defeat at Tobruk, which has been captured by Rommel, and everything is really teetering. But it's not just a question of shoring up the empire. It's a question of stabilizing the Allies' sea lanes through the Mediterranean and also through the Suez Canal, but also the oil that was so vital in the Middle East. And Rommel, interesting enough, Hugo, writes in August 1944, this is obviously, he's recovering from injury in Normandy. He says, we missed a real opportunity. If Hitler had put more troops in earlier, I mean, he is going to double down now by sending lots of troops to Tunisia, which is why it was such a tough fight. But if he'd sent anything like the number of troops earlier, they almost certainly would have got to the Suez Canal and captured and therefore control the oil fields in the Middle East. And Rommel wanted them to go even further, actually go through the Middle East and attack the oil fields of the Caucasus, which of course were the target of the Stalingrad campaign, from two sides, both from the Soviet Union but also from the Middle East.
So in the end, then, how did the Allies do it? I mean, how are the Nazis defeated in North Africa? What's the trick? What's the secret there?
Well, the trick was getting enough troops on the ground, but they also had some very good commanders. I mean, what you see in this North African campaign is some of the best commanders for the rest of the war cut their teeth there. So Patton's there, Bradley is there, Ike, of course, is there. It's his first command, Eisenhower. And then on the British side, you have arguably the two best generals, certainly in Europe, for the rest of the war, and that's Monty and Alexander. So it's pretty much the first team, and we don't know a lot of these guys until the end of the Tunisian campaign. And there were disasters. The famous Kasserine Pass, which was the last victory really won by Rommel, when he destroys a relatively inexperienced force of American infantry and armor. But what is fascinating about the Western allies, particularly the Americans, who were, of course, very inexperienced, as I say, is how quickly they learn the business of fighting the Germans. And I think this is an absolutely key learning ground for future warfare to come in Sicily, Italy, and ultimately Northwest Europe. But in the end, Hugo, the benefits of taking North Africa were, in my view, enormous. They knock out 2,400 Axis planes. They capture an army of 250,000 strong, the majority of which was German. And these are not just any troops. These are veteran troops, some of whom have been fighting in North Africa for the last 2 or 3 years. And Rommel flies back to Europe in March 1943 before the end, pleads with Hitler to get these guys out and if he does, he can guarantee that he will safeguard Southern Europe. He will use these troops to prevent any incursion in Southern Europe. That doesn't happen. And of course, just a few months later, you get the invasion of Sicily. And sooner or later, the Italians are knocked out of the war. So it's a tremendous blow. And as you said at the beginning, and as I argue in the book, the third great turning point in the Second World War.
Briefly, I'm afraid we're nearly out of time, but does Hitler recognize it for the disaster it is immediately, or does he take some persuading?
Well, he does recognize immediately when he hears that the Western Allies have invaded French North Africa. Obviously, he knows of the fighting that's going on in Egypt. He immediately says this is an area of the greatest strategic and political importance, and that's why he doubles down and sends troops there. Again, when Rommel pleads with him to get everyone out in March, he says again, we cannot withdraw from North Africa. It's too important for the defense of Europe. So he did realize, but he realized too late.
We got to leave it there. Saul David, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. The book is Tunisgrad, Victory in North Africa. It is out now and it is available to order at the Times Bookshop, where Times Plus members can get a 20% discount. Just visit timesbookshop.co.uk.